All right, welcome back to the last lecture of the year. This is lecture 19 on frog anatomy and how it connects to human anatomy. So we are using frogs. Um, Even though some frogs across the world are in decline because of a fungal infection caused by the chytrid fungus, the frogs that we're using or would have used, or that you will see in the pictures, are bullfrogs, and they seem to be resistant to this fungus, even though they're being raised in farms for dissection where the population densities are usually really high, which, as we know from our current experience, high population densities are not great when there is an infectious agent passing between individuals. This fungus has hit tropical frogs and salamanders especially hard, especially in the Americas. You can see the worst places are Mesoamerica, that's like Central America, and South America. North American amphibians haven't been hit too hard yet. So the problem with this fungus is that it infects skin. And if you've ever had athlete's foot or something like that, you know that for us, having a fungal infection of the skin is unpleasant. But we only use our skin as a protective covering, right? From last exercise, we know that human skin, the outer layer, is dead keratinized cells. Um, Something like athlete's foot, the fungus can get deep enough into the dermis where it's attacking living tissue, and um, that's when it really becomes a problem for us, and it's painful. Um, for frogs, though, they don't have that extra layer of dead keratinized cells, right? And their skin is not only protective, but it also plays a function in gas exchange. Okay, so they have to keep it moist, which unfortunately is a really good environment for this fungus to live in. All right, so just some external anatomy, and then as we get into the oral cavity. So adult frogs have don't have a tail. Okay, so and they also don't technically have what we call an anus. Technically, an anus is just the exit from the digestive tract. Instead, frogs have what's called a cloaca. Okay, and the cloacal opening, even though it looks like it's at the end of the body here, they're as tadpoles, they actually do have a post anal or post cloacal tail, which was one of those attributes of chordates that we learned about in the last exercise. Salamanders generally are still going to have that tail as adults. So the cloaca is the exit point for the reproductive system, for the digestive tract, and for the excretory system. Okay, we have separate openings for at least most of these. In general, though, all the parts that a frog has are basically the same as the parts that you have. Just relative sizes are different, and some details of placement are a little different as well. Let's look a little closer at the oral anatomy. So in this image, the top of the mouth is at the top of the image, and the bottom is at the bottom. The lower jaw is at the bottom of the image. Okay. The muscles and skin on the side have been cut so that the mouth can be opened really, really wide. So if we start from the top of the image where that person's thumb is in the glove, they are lifting up the upper jaw there. Underneath their thumb and around the entire rim of the upper jaw is what's called the maxilla. And there is sort of a ridge of teeth running across the whole upper jaw called the maxillary teeth. Okay, just below the thumb in the middle are what are called the vomerine teeth. Okay, there is a bone called the vomer. You have one too. It makes up part of your hard palate. And in a lot of organisms, but not in us, there are additional teeth that grow out of the vomer. Okay, so your teeth in your upper jaw are maxillary teeth, right? They run around the edge of your mouth. If you had vomerine teeth, they would kind of stick out from the middle of your hard palate, which would be pretty strange. To either side of the vomerine teeth are the internal nares. Nare is a fancy word for nostril, right? So this is the these are the openings that connect the oral cavity to the external nares. Sorry, I'm back. Just someone buzzed my buzzer. Um, all right, just below the internal nares, you can see a bulge from the eyes. There's a video that you should watch posted to the assignment of frogs feeding. And one of the sort of strange things about how they do this is that when they go to swallow things, they kind of have to push their eyes down into their mouth to help get the food item swallowed. So you can see the eye bulge there. Posterior to the eye bulge are eustachian tubes. And then right in the middle of everything, on the dorsal side, is the entrance to the esophagus, which leads to the stomach. And ventral to that is the glottis. And the glottis is a muscular opening that leads to the lung, okay, through the trachea. At the very tip of the lower jaw, you can see the tongue. Okay, the tongue is actually attached to the front. Our tongue is attached back by our epiglottis, but their tongue is attached to the front of their jaw for a couple of different reasons. That works out well. One, they can basically extend their tongue, right? Again, watch that video on feeding. But they basically can shoot their tongue out at prey objects. Another reason, which you can't really see in this video or in this image, is between the tongue and the glottis, there is an opening to a buccal cavity. And that's sort of the balloon under their head that they can blow up with air. And that's going to be important in terms of how they actually breathe, which we'll talk about a little later. Okay, so here is the image slide that you need to look at for questions 2 and 3. Feel free to pause the video for as long as you need to look at this. There's also a separate PDF of just these image slides. All right, there aren't really any questions about this in your worksheet, or not many at least. But you are expected to know the basic parts of the skeleton in terms of the frog and how it relates to people. Okay, so both frogs and people have what's called an axial skeleton, right? Which is basically the midline where the parts are down the center, and then the appendicular skeleton. Okay, these are the paired appendages that hang off the axial skeleton. Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to know a lot of details here. The axial skeleton is made up of your skull, your vertebral column, and your ribs. And then the appendicular skeleton is made up of your shoulder girdles, your arms, your pectoral girdle, and your legs. Okay, so in your appendages, there are a couple different types of bones that you do need to know. Okay, in your hand and in your foot, your fingers and toes are called phalanges. Okay, but the bones that support them or that they connect to have different names. In your forelimb, which for us is an arm, Okay, the phalanges attach to what are called metacarpals, and then the metacarpals attach to the carpals, which make up your wrist, and then the carpals attach to the radius and the ulna. In your leg, the phalanges attach to the metatarsals, and then the tarsals make up your ankle, and then they attach to the tibia and fibula in your leg. Okay, but same idea. Long, skinny bones, lots of bones, two bones. Okay, so in a frog, they have phalanges just like we do. In the forelimb, you don't need to know the carpals and the metacarpals, really. Their radius and ulna are fused together into one bone. Okay, and then they have a humerus to connect the radio-ulna back to their shoulder girdle. Okay, in their hind limbs, like our legs, okay, the metatarsals are very long. Ours are as well, like most of what makes up your foot is metatarsals. Okay, but the big difference between them and us is the tarsals. Okay, in a frog, the tarsals are very long. In a human being, the tarsals are small, right, and squished together to make up your ankle. Okay, so that tarsal part is the same as your ankle. And then where you have a tibia and fibula as separate bones, they have a combined tibiofibula, which attaches to the femur to connect back to the pelvic girdle. All right, the next thing to talk about are leg muscles. Okay, the first part of this talks about the muscles surrounding the tibiofibula, so the lower part of the leg between the knee and the ankle. And there are basically two that you need to understand here. The gastrocnemius and the peroneus. Okay, so the gastrocnemius is on sort of the back of their tibiofibula, and the peroneus is on the front of their tibiofibula. Okay, and you have questions here that ask you about which one flexes and which one extends. So the gastrocnemius is the bigger sort of bulgy muscle on the back, okay, that connects to the back of the knee down to the back of the ankle, to the tarsals. Okay, and the peroneus is the thinner muscle from the front of the knee to sort of the front of the tarsals. Okay, so when it asks about flex and extend, okay, flex means to move your toes closer to your knee. Okay, and extend means to sort of point your toes and your foot out. Okay, so the gastrocnemius is a lot like the big calf muscle you have on the back of your lower leg. Okay, as we move to the upper leg and talk about the muscles that surround the femur. So this first view here is from the dorsal side. Okay, and the dorsal side shows the triceps femoris, which is on kind of the anterior surface of the upper leg, and the semimembranosus, which is on the posterior surface. Okay, so the triceps femoris, like you, if you're sitting and you put your hand down on your upper leg, you're basically touching the triceps femoris. Okay, and then if you put your hand under your leg, that's where the semimembranosus would be. Okay, so that's the semimembranosus is like what we think of as our hamstring. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that, but basically it's the stuff under your leg when you're sitting, and the triceps femoris is what's on top of your leg when you're sitting. Okay, so again, the question here about flexing and extending. Okay, so flexing means to bend your knee, and extend means to straighten your leg out. Okay, so those are the two major muscles of the leg for flexing and extending at the knee. There are some other muscles in the leg that you should know as well. If you look at the ventral side of the leg, so you can see the belly of the frog here. Okay. On the posterior side with a ventral view are the gracilis major and minor. So these are muscles that kind of help like pull your knees towards each other. Okay. And then to the anterior side in a ventral view, you have the sartorius, which is a ribbon-like muscle that covers sort of everything. And underneath the sartorius are what are called adductors. Okay, again, these are going to help change the position of your leg relative to your body. Okay, you can still see the triceps femoris here. It's easier to see with a dorsal view, but it covers the whole anterior. Right? Remember, the triceps femoris is about changing the position of your lower leg relative to your upper leg. Okay, but the sartorius and the adductors and the gracilis muscles that we just spoke about are more about changing the position of your upper leg relative to your torso. Okay. If you move that sartorius aside, remember it's like a flat, wide ribbon. If you move that aside, you can see the adductor muscles a little better underneath it. All right, the next part of this is going to get into the abdominal cavity of the frog. Okay. The first aspect that we're going to talk about is the reproductive systems. So frogs are either male or female. On the left is the male, and on the right is female. Okay, so on the left you can see a testicle. Okay, there's another one in there somewhere. And those sort of orange, waxy looking things, which are also found in the female, are the fat bodies. Okay, so testicles, testes, look kind of like ovally round objects, right? But the ovaries, you can see in the top is an immature female, right, whose ovary is not yet producing eggs. Okay, and on the bottom is a gravid female. That means she has taken in sperm, she's produced eggs, her eggs have been fertilized. Okay, but she has not yet laid her eggs. Okay, so you can see both of the ovaries are very sort of fan-like, but the gravid one is much larger and much darker. Okay, in order to produce those eggs, that is what the females need the fat body for, right? So frogs and amphibians in general don't tend to store a lot of fat, right? And the fat that they do store is all associated with their gonads, right? Their testicles or their ovaries. And they use that energy to produce gametes during the mating season. Okay, but unlike us, unlike other kinds of mammals, they don't distribute fat into other parts of their body. Okay, we use fat for all kinds of things. We use it for energy storage. We use it for insulation to try to keep our body heat in. But frogs don't need any of that. Okay, frogs are exothermic. Basically, they're going to have the same body temperature as the environment around them. All right, as we get into the digestive system, so it doesn't really show it here, right? But so in this picture, the fingers at the sort of top left are holding the liver up and away. Okay, so that you can see the organs underneath. If you've ever dissected a pig, it's basically the same sort of layout, right? And if you ever end up in a career where you are looking inside of a human, you're going to see something that looks almost identical to this too. Okay, so the parts that you can't see above the liver, there is a lung towards the sort of dorsal side of the frog. Um, it's not like our lungs, it's not in a separate cavity. And we'll talk more about that later. In human beings, the thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm. In frogs, that is not the case. Okay, so in this picture, the heart and the lung are still anterior to the parts that have been dissected, so you can't see those yet. Okay, when you lift up the liver, that dark green thing on the left is the gallbladder, but we'll actually talk more about that on the next slide. Okay, let's just talk about the digestive tract first. So, food items in the mouth pass through the esophagus. Okay, and the esophagus, just like yours, it goes behind your heart, past your lungs, sort of behind or through your liver, and empties into the stomach. Okay, so you can see the stomach on the left-hand side of this frog, okay, and the right-hand side of your picture. And it has the same jobs that your stomach does. It starts chemical digestion, chemical breakdown, and mechanical breakdown of your food. Okay, where the stomach attaches to the small intestine is what's called the pyloric sphincter. This is a muscular ring that opens and closes to control the distribution of what's called chyme, right? The sort of digested fluid that your stomach produces moving into your small intestine. Okay, just like in you, the small intestine is narrower, it's longer, and it's coiled. Okay, so the chyme moves through there, it continues being chemically digested. The frog's absorbing nutrients into its bloodstream until eventually the small intestine attaches to the large intestine, here what's called the colon. Theirs is relatively short, and the colon absorbs water back from the digested food, and it sort of compacts it into fecal matter, okay, which can be stored and then expelled. Okay, just like the reproductive structures we just talked about, the colon empties into the cloaca. Okay, some of the associated organs, I already mentioned the liver. There you can see it on top of the stomach, okay, and on top of everything else where it hasn't been picked up. Okay, underneath the liver on the right-hand side of the frog is the gallbladder. It is dark green. It's nice and shiny. The liver produces a substance called bile, which is kind of like soap, which is used to break down sort of large globules of fat. And that bile is stored in the gallbladder in order to be secreted into the small intestines for digestion. In the connective tissue close to the pyloric sphincter, right, where the stomach attaches to the small intestines, you'll find the pancreas, just like in you. The pancreas produces digestive enzymes. It produces signaling molecules, okay, just like in you, that get secreted into the bloodstream or get secreted along with bile into the small intestine to aid with digestion. Okay, so here is the image that you need for question 7. Okay, again, you can pause it here and do what you need to do, or you could look at the PDF of these images as well. All right, the last system in the abdominal cavity that we need to talk about is the excretory system. Just as in you, frogs have 2 kidneys. They are going to be behind everything else, or sort of dorsal to everything else, and they're actually embedded in the back wall of the organism. They're not actually part of the cavity because they're outside of what's called the peritoneum. Okay, that's a connective tissue layer that lines the entire abdominal cavity. Each kidney is connected through a ureter to the urinary bladder, okay, which is going to be very, very close to the cloaca. And then the urinary bladder connects to the cloaca through urethra, just like in you. All right, one really interesting system that we haven't really talked about is the respiratory system. The way that frogs breathe is very different from us. I mentioned they do have a lung, okay? The lungs are up by their heart, which is anterior to the liver. Okay, in the image on the upper right, you can kind of see one part of the lungs um, right next to the stomach. Okay, in you, that could never happen because there is a muscular layer of connective tissue called the diaphragm that completely separates your cardiothoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. Okay, and you use that diaphragm in order to cause your lungs to expand and contract. Okay, lungs do not have any muscle of their own. They cannot change their own shape. Okay, think of them kind of like balloons. Okay, balloons can't suck air in on their own. You have to force the air in. Okay, and lungs work the same way. As I said, in us, when our diaphragm contracts, it pulls down towards your abdominal cavity and increases the volume of your thoracic cavity. Okay, and that change in volume, if you remember PV equals nRT, right? That change in volume causes a difference in pressure between the air inside your lungs and the air in the outside world. So when your diaphragm contracts and increases the volume, air gets sucked into your lungs. And then when your diaphragm relaxes, it decreases the volume of your thoracic cavity and pushes air back out again. Okay? Frogs don't have a diaphragm, right? So they need some other muscular force that allows them to change the volume of their lungs. Okay, so they actually have a two-step system. Okay, they have lungs and they also have what's called a buccal cavity. The buccal cavity sits under their lower jaw, and it's basically an inflatable balloon, just like their lungs are. Okay, but it can't do any gas exchange. So it doesn't have the kind of blood vessels necessary to actually be exchanging gases within the buccal cavity. Okay, and you can't really see it in any of these images, but anterior to the glottis, so the glottis is a muscular opening that can be opened and closed, right? That controls the movement of air between the mouth, like the oral cavity, and the lungs. Okay, below the tongue, in front of the glottis, is an opening to the buccal cavity. Okay, and that's another reason why their tongue needs to be attached at the front of their mouth instead of at the back, because it could block this opening to the buccal cavity. Okay, so frogs don't actually breathe through their mouth ever. They only breathe through their nares or their nostrils. Okay, so for a frog to breathe, it has to have its mouth closed. And because it can open and close its nares at will, and it can open and close its glottis at will, it has sort of a two-step process. So when a frog goes to breathe, it has its glottis closed, but it opens its nares. Okay? And it uses muscles in its buccal cavity to expand the buccal cavity and fill it with air. And then the nostrils close. So now the air is trapped at high pressure inside the buccal cavity and it has nowhere to go. Then the frog opens the glottis and squeezes the buccal cavity to make it smaller. Those air molecules need somewhere to go because they're experiencing higher pressure. And because the glottis is now open, those molecules can move into the lung where gas exchange takes place. Okay? When it's time to breathe out, the glottis opens again as the frog expands the buccal cavity. Okay? So the pressure in the buccal cavity drops and it fills up with the air. And then the frog closes its glottis, opens its nares, and contracts the buccal cavity again. Okay, so it's a two-step process, whereas we use just a one-step process, right? Frogs have to fill up their buccal cavity and then use that to fill up their lungs, right? And then they have to use their buccal cavity to suck air out of their lungs, and then again use their buccal cavity to expel it from their body. We don't have to do that because we have a thoracic cavity sealed off by that diaphragm, which basically does the same job. Okay. Just like with us, frogs can make noises, and just like with us, the noises they make have to do with air moving over vocal cords, right? So the only reason you can hear me right now is because air in my lungs is passing over some vibrating connective tissue in my larynx, right, which creates these sounds. Frogs create their croaks the same way, by passing air between their buccal cavity and their lungs over vocal cords. All right, the last system we need to talk about is the circulatory system. So frogs, just like all vertebrates, have a closed circulatory system. Their blood should always, always, always be in their heart or blood vessels. Okay, unlike us though, we have a 4-chambered heart. We have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Okay, one of each on the left and right side of our heart. Frogs only have 3 chambers. They still have a right and left atrium, but they only have 1 ventricle. Okay, the conus arteriosus is like your aorta. Okay, and it's connected to the right atrium. So the reason that we have 4 chambers, and mammals and birds are the only ones that do, is because it's way more efficient. If you can see in this diagram on the left, okay, oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs or coming back from capillaries in the skin, because again, I mentioned this earlier, frogs can also do gas exchange through their moist skin. Okay, that blood that's coming back from places where it just got oxygen has to mix with blood coming back from the body. Okay, so blood returning from the body comes through the right atrium, and blood coming back from the lungs or the skin capillaries, the oxygenating circuits, what's called the pulmocutaneous circuit. Pulmo means lungs, pulmonary, and cutaneous refers to skin. Okay, so the pulmocutaneous circuit is where they get oxygen. And then the systemic circuit is the circuit that takes that oxygen to all the cells in the body and picks up carbon dioxide. Okay, in us, those 2 circuits, are the ones that serve those purposes, are completely separated by the 2 different sides of our heart, the left and right side. In a frog, though, those 2 circuits mix in the single ventricle. So what that means is, instead of being completely deoxygenated or completely oxygenated, the blood in their ventricle is a mix. Okay? So the blood that goes to their pulmocutaneous circuit has more oxygen than it should, and the blood that goes to their systemic circuit has less oxygen than it should. Okay? Ideally, the blood that goes to your lungs is going to have almost no oxygen at all. Right? And the blood that goes to your body is going to have as much oxygen in it as possible. And we can do that because we have 2 separate ventricles that keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood apart. Okay, frogs can get away with it because they're small and they have lower metabolic needs than we do. Okay, if a human being was born with a heart like this, they would have problems. And I know that for a fact because one of my nephews was actually born with a hole between his left and right ventricle. And most of the time he was okay. It wasn't a very big hole. But as he got into junior high and high school, it turned out that he was a promising cross country runner. And as he matured and was using his heart more and things got more serious for him, he started to have problems to the point where he actually collapsed during a race. And in the end, they had to do surgery to close up this hole between his two ventricles. Otherwise, he could have had more serious problems later in life. Okay, but it's not a problem for frogs. They seem to do just fine. All right, so the next slide is the last one, and it has the images you need for question 9. Okay, I'll leave it up for a little while, but again, you could pause it or look at this slide in the separate PDFs if you want to. All right, I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much. Bye.